Bryce Langford stood beside Kendra in his tux, eyes cold, saying nothing. Like silence was his final verdict. A ripple of whispers spread through the donors. Someone laughed. Someone filmed. Dana's iPhone vibrated in her clutch. A notification preview from Bryce's account. Access revoked by primary holder. Stamped with the same minute Kendra spoke. Dana opened her mouth, but security was already moving in, blocking her path, trapping her between velvet ropes and stairs. Then the doors parted. Harold Langford, her father-in-law, stepped in, and his gaze locked on the stage like he'd just seen a crime. Someone in hotel security already had the camera footage queued. 14 hours earlier, Dana Holloway was doing what she always did, showing up for everyone else before she showed up for herself. At 48, she worked nights as an RN at Bellevue, the kind who rechecks a pulse oximeter twice because one bad reading can ruin a life. She kept a spare granola bar in her pocket for patients who hadn't eaten, and she never billed overtime even when she should have. At 6:10 a.m., she stopped at Starbucks for a small coffee, then sat in her Toyota in the employee garage and paid her mother's facility invoice on her iPhone, praying the card wouldn't decline. Ruth's Parkinson's meds weren't optional. Neither was Lila's orthodontist deposit due Friday. Dana wrote the numbers on a folded sticky note, slipped it behind her wedding photo in her wallet, and told herself she'd figure it out after she slept. Home was quiet except for the dishwasher. Dana kissed Lila's forehead, packed her lunch, and left a note that said, "Yeah, text me if you feel weird today." Lila had learned to read moods the way Dana read charts. Dana hated that. Before crawling into bed, Dana called Ruth's nurse, reviewed the medication list, and promised to bring fresh socks after the gala. She also sent $40 to a coworker whose kid needed a field trip fee because Dana couldn't stand to see a child miss out. Then she checked her own bank balance, thin as paper, and deleted 3 unanswered texts to her best friend because Bryce hated outside opinions. Bryce was already dressed when he came downstairs. Crisp shirt, cufflinks, phone face down. He didn't ask about Ruth. He didn't ask how the shift went. He only said, "You're coming tonight. Smile. Don't talk money." His tone made it sound like a favor. Dana nodded because arguing cost energy she didn't have. And the gala mattered to Bryce's image, and Bryce's image controlled their health insurance, their mortgage, their breathing room. Still, something felt off, like walking into a patient room and hearing a monitor beep wrong. Bryce smelled like a new cologne. His sleeve brushed her arm, and she noticed a faint smear of glitter she didn't wear. When he left, Dana opened the kitchen drawer for ibuprofen and found an envelope she hadn't seen before. The Ritz-Carlton letterhead, tomorrow's donor seating plan, and her name printed near the back, far from family. In the margin, someone had handwritten, "Let her speak, then escort her out." Dana had told herself 1,000 times she could leave if she had to. A small apartment, a clean start, a life where she didn't flinch when a door shut too hard. But every time she pictured it, and the same 3 faces appeared in her mind, Ruth, Lila, and the version of herself that still believed marriage meant shelter. Ruth's care was a moving target. Parkinson's didn't just steal balance, it stole time, dignity, and money in steady bites. The facility needed monthly payments, but it also needed quick approvals for medication changes, physical therapy, emergency transport. Dana could handle the nursing questions. What she couldn't handle was the fine print. The insurance policy sat under Bryce's employer plan, and Bryce was the gatekeeper. If he wanted to delay a call, accidentally miss an email, or claim she misunderstood coverage, Ruth would pay first. Lila's world depended on stability, too. School bus schedules, a safe neighborhood, a bedroom with posters and homework spread across the desk. And Dana had watched kids unravel after divorce battles and custody threats. She knew how quickly best interest turned into a weapon when someone had better lawyers and a cleaner public story. Then there was Dana's own career, her last honest lifeline. One complaint, one donor whisper, one headline tied to Bryce's world, and the hospital could put her on leave while the board investigated. Nursing wasn't a hobby. It was the only thing that belonged to her. She opened the drawer where she kept Ruth's paperwork and found it jammed with new documents Bryce had organized. A change of beneficiary form, a healthcare proxy she didn't remember signing, a foundation volunteer reimbursement sheet with her name typed at the top, like she was the one requesting money. It was subtle, but it wasn't random. It was a trail being built. On Dana's phone buzzed. A bank email. Authorized user removed. Her stomach tightened. She walked to the fridge, stared at the family photo held up by a magnet. Bryce smiling like a man she used to know, and realized how carefully he'd been shrinking her options for years. She sat at the kitchen table, hands flat, and tried to breathe like she taught anxious patients. Then a text flashed from Ruth's facility. Coverage verification needed. Mr. Bryce Langford must confirm by 9 a.m., or care levels will be adjusted. By 7:45 p.m., the Ritz-Carlton on Central Park South looked like a snow globe made for wealthy people. Valets in black coats, a line of Mercedes sedans at the curb, and guests stepping onto the marble as if the night belonged to them. Dana walked in with Bryce a half step ahead of her, his hand never reaching back for hers. Her iPhone was warm in her palm from checking the same message again and again. Ruth's facility needed coverage verification by morning. Inside the ballroom, everything glittered. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, donor cards printed in thick paper, a string quartet playing music that sounded expensive but lonely. Dana noticed the practical things first. Exit doors, staff routes, where security stood, where cameras hid in the corners of the ceiling. A polished sign near the corridor read, "Smile, security cameras in use." She told herself that was good. Cameras meant truth existed somewhere, even when people lied. The stage sat at the center like an altar. A microphone waited under a spotlight. 2 screens flanked it, looping photos of smiling children and the Langford Foundation logo. Dana's stomach tightened when she saw the seating chart. Bryce's family table was front and center. Her name was printed near the back, beside miscellaneous volunteers, like she was an afterthought dressed in borrowed diamonds. Kendra Vale floated through the room in a pale gown, greeting donors like she owned the air. She touched Bryce's sleeve once, brief, familiar, and he didn't flinch. He only checked his phone, then slipped it into his pocket with a calm Dana had never seen at home. Not nervous, not guilty, prepared. A waiter offered Dana champagne. She declined and held her clutch tighter, feeling her wedding ring press against the satin lining like a warning. Nearby, 2 board members leaned in and whispered, glancing at her, then away. Dana couldn't step toward them. Yeah, Bryce had positioned her behind a rope of conversation and status she couldn't cross without making a scene. Then a staffer with a headset hurried past, eyes down, murmuring, 5 minutes, as if a show was about to begin. Across the room, Dana saw Bryce quietly hand the head of security a folded paper, and her own name was written on the outside. Bryce Langford didn't look like a villain. He looked like every polished executive Manhattan was built to protect. Calm smile, controlled posture, a watch that caught the chandelier light each time he lifted his glass. But Dana had lived with him long enough to recognize the pattern. When Bryce got quiet, something was about to be taken from her. He guided her through the crowd the way you guide luggage through an airport, never asking what she wanted, and only placing her where she wouldn't interfere. "Stay here," he murmured, nodding toward the back tables, then turned toward the front as if she'd already agreed. Dana watched him greet board members with warmth he never used at home. To them, he was devoted, generous, steady, a son carrying a legacy. At home, Bryce carried something else. When Dana had asked last month why her card kept declining, Bryce had leaned against the kitchen counter and said, "You're stressed. You probably hit a limit." He'd said it like comfort, not control. He always had a soft explanation ready until she stopped asking. The second she questioned a withdrawal, he called her emotional. The second she mentioned Ruth's rising costs, he called her ungrateful. And when she tried to set boundaries for Lila, he smiled and said, "Yes, don't turn my daughter against me." As if Lila belonged to him more than to both of them. Tonight, Bryce's motive was written in the room. A future CEO being crowned by donors, not by love. Dana saw it in the way he kept checking his iPhone, in the way Kendra Vale hovered close enough to be mistaken for his partner, in the way security watched Dana more than anyone else. Bryce didn't fear cheating rumors. He feared losing control of the story. A side lounge door opened as Bryce stepped inside. Through the gap, Dana caught a flash of his MacBook screen on a marble console. An email chain with Kendra's name and the subject line, Gala Narrative Final. Another tab showed a spreadsheet with neat columns. Risk, response, removal. It wasn't the language of marriage, it was the language of a takeover. Dana's throat tightened, as Bryce wasn't just betraying her. He was preparing witnesses to believe she deserved it. Then Bryce reappeared, smoothing his cuff, eyes landing on Dana with a look she didn't recognize as love. Only calculation. Kendra slipped to his side and whispered, "Security is ready. Your wife won't touch that mic." Kendra Vale moved through the Ritz-Carlton ballroom like she'd been born under chandeliers. She wasn't just Bryce's events director. Tonight she was the conductor, guiding donors into the right conversations, positioning cameras where the light was flattering, steering waiters like chess pieces so the room felt effortless. Dana watched her from the back tables, trying to pretend she wasn't watching. That was the trick in this world. You were allowed to notice, but never allowed to name what you noticed. Kendra leaned in toward an older couple Dana recognized from the Foundation newsletter. Big donors photographed every year with Bryce and Harold. Kendra touched the woman's forearm, smiled with concern, then tilted her head toward Dana as if sharing a sad secret. The woman's face tightened, sympathy curdling into judgment. A minute later, the man looked at Dana like she'd already been convicted. Dana's stomach sank. Kendra wasn't gossiping. She was placing a story into the room, quietly, professionally, so the humiliation would feel deserved when it happened. Kendra crossed paths with Bryce and handed him a small card. Dana couldn't read it from here, but she saw Bryce's expression shift into relief, like a plan had just clicked into place. Then Kendra pivoted toward the AV booth and spoke to a technician, her voice soft but firm. The technician nodded too quickly, like someone being managed. Dana's iPhone buzzed again in her clutch. Ruth's facility reminder, the same cold wording about verification. Dana swallowed, heat rising behind her eyes. She couldn't make a scene. If she grabbed Bryce's arm and demanded answers, she'd look unstable. If she marched to the stage, security would stop her. Bryce had built a perfect trap, a crowd that punished emotion and rewarded silence. Kendra paused near a mirrored column and checked her own phone. Dana caught the reflection. Kendra's screen showed a message thread with Bryce's name at the top. One line was visible before Kendra turned it away. "After the mic, she's done." Dana's fingers went numb. Not because of jealousy, because of the cold precision. Dana had spent years saving strangers at work, yet she couldn't save herself from the person who claimed to love her. Kendra smiled toward Dana then, brief, almost pitying, like Dana was already a ghost the room had agreed to forget. She lifted her champagne flute and walked toward the stage steps. Dana saw Kendra slip a USB drive to the AV tech, and the label on it read, "Dana, reimbursement proof, show tonight." Kendra didn't strike with a scream, she struck with manners. She drifted to Dana's table with a smile that looked kind from across the room, then leaned in close enough that Dana could smell her perfume. "Oh, Dana," Kendra said, loud enough for the women at the next table to hear. "You're in the volunteer section tonight. It's sweet that you wanted to feel involved." Dana's cheeks burned. The donor couple beside her went still, like they'd just learned where she belonged. When Dana glanced toward Bryce at the front tables, hoping he'd catch the humiliation and shut it down with one sentence. He didn't even look back. He kept laughing with board members as if Dana's discomfort was background music. Kendra's eyes flicked to Dana's left hand. "That ring is sentimental," she added, her voice warm, her meaning cold. "A lot of women hold on to symbols when they don't have access." She tapped the edge of Dana's clutch lightly like she owned the space around Dana's body. If you need anything, ask security. They've been told to help. Help. Dana understood the word the way nurses understood coded language. Contain. A waiter passed with champagne. Dana reached for a water instead, fingers trembling. She could feel people watching her choose the water, like even that was a test. On her iPhone buzzed again, Ruth's facility reminder, and she swallowed hard, forcing her face into something neutral. In this room, showing pain was the same as confessing guilt. Kendra moved on, stopping at a nearby donor table and laughing just a touch too loudly. Dana caught fragments. Stress. Financial strain. Complicated home life. The donors nodded as if they'd already decided Dana was the kind of woman who caused problems. Dana stood, needing air, but the moment she stepped toward the aisle, a security guard shifted his stance and subtly blocked the path. Not touching her. Not threatening. Just making sure everyone saw who had control. She turned toward the corridor by the AV booth, pretending she was looking for the restroom. That's when she heard Bryce's voice. Low, urgent, behind the velvet curtain near the service hall. Kendra, don't improvise, Bryce said. Stick to the script. After she signs, the reimbursement trail points to her. Kendra's reply came like a blade wrapped in silk. She won't even realize the trap until the crowd does. Dana froze in the shadows as Bryce added, and if she refuses to sign, escort her out anyway. Make her look unstable. Dana backed away from the velvet curtain as quietly as she could, forcing her face into the same polite blankness she used with difficult patience. In this room, the first person to look emotional was the first person to lose. She smoothed her dress, lifted her chin, and walked toward the corridor as if she'd simply decided to check her lipstick. The hallway outside the ballroom was cooler, quieter. She noticed things she couldn't help noticing. Exit signs, staff doors, and the black camera dome above the archway. A posted plaque near the service elevator read, "Smile, security cameras in use." For the first time all night, Dana felt a thin thread of relief. Machines didn't care who was rich. Machines remembered. A catering cart rolled past, and behind it, a security supervisor stood with a tablet, glancing at a live feed. Dana didn't stare. She pretended to scroll her iPhone, but she watched the reflection in a mirror. Tiny boxes of footage, timestamps marching forward like heartbeats. She rounded the corner near a side lounge and nearly collided with Bryce's assistant, who was flustered, hands full of programs. The assistant mumbled an apology and hurried away. On a marble console inside the lounge, an iPad lay face up like it had been forgotten on purpose. Dana's pulse kicked. She told herself not to touch it, but the screen lit with a notification before she could look away. Transaction approved, it read, followed by a Fifth Avenue jeweler's name and an amount so high Dana's stomach turned. Beneath it, another alert popped up. Foundation reimbursement processed. Same minute, same rhythm. Like the money had been moving while Dana was being positioned for blame. Her hands shook, but her nurse brain stayed clinical. One photo, one clean proof clue. She lifted her phone, snapped the iPad screen with the timestamp visible, and set the iPad back exactly where it was, angled the same way, no smudges. Then she stepped away, breathing through her nose the way she taught Lila when panic hit. A security guard appeared at the end of the corridor. He didn't rush. He simply shifted, now blocking the easiest path back to the ballroom. His body camera light blinked red. He met Dana's eyes for half a second. Sympathy, warning, and something like regret. As he walked past, he murmured, "Ma'am, our cameras caught who gave the order, and Mr. Langford's father already asked for the footage. Hoi fet trien fan sin, choju bon trum, tu jam bao viet jung bon trum tu chicho su, shedishna moi tu bangino jo. Nai no jam bao kich bang kau truk trio view." Viet bang tiengan. Midena walked back toward the ballroom with her pulse still hammering, but Bryce intercepted her before she reached the doors. He didn't grab her arm. He didn't need to. He simply angled his body so the only direction left was the side corridor near the coat check, where the music was muffled and the walls were lined with people who looked important enough to be believed. Dana, he said, voice low, almost tender, like he was trying to save her from herself. We're going to handle this quietly. He held out a thin folder and a silver pen. The folder had the foundation logo and a neat tab labeled Authorization. Dana's nurse instincts kicked in. Read before you sign. She scanned the first page and felt the blood drain from her face. It wasn't an authorization, it was a liability transfer. Language that made her responsible for misallocated reimbursements and administrative discrepancies. Her name was typed in bold. Her signature line waited like a trap with a bow on it. I'm not signing this, Dana said, keeping her voice steady because people were watching. A donor couple stood nearby, pretending to look for their coats while listening. 2 staff members lingered with clipboards, and eyes flicking between Dana and Bryce. Bryce's smile didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. You don't understand what's at stake, he murmured. If you make this messy, the board will assume the worst. The hospital will assume the worst. Your license, your mother's care, Lila's stability. Don't do that to them. Dana's phone buzzed in her clutch, another reminder from Ruth's facility, the same cold wording about verification and care levels. Bryce glanced down as if he could feel the vibration too, and Dana hated him for how perfectly he had timed everything. You already removed me from the account, Dana whispered. That's not what this is about, Bryce replied, smooth as glass. This is about protecting the foundation. Dana looked past him and saw the security guard from the hallway reposition, subtly closing off the exit. No hands, no shouting. Just a quiet wall made of uniforms and reputation. Then Kendra appeared, glowing, composed, holding a small card like a stage cue. She smiled at Dana with practiced sympathy. I hate that it came to this, she said, loud enough for the eavesdroppers. But integrity matters. Dana's wedding ring pressed into her skin as she clenched her fist. She realized Bryce wasn't trying to persuade her. He was trying to force her into a choice where every outcome served him. Bryce placed the pen directly in Dana's hand and whispered, Sign now, or I make the next call, and your mother loses her care by morning. Hai fatrin fan moi choju bontram, tu jam bao viet jung bontram, tu chichosu shedish na moi tu bangi, no jiu nai. Now jam bao kich ban kao truk triu view viet bang tiengan. Mi jan sui nanghi trong hai. Moi ba gyai Kendra Vale stepped onto the stage like she belonged behind the microphone. The spotlight caught her pale gown, then slid across the screens beside her. Photos of smiling children, the Langford Foundation logo, a clean story donors love to believe in. The room quieted the way it does when money expects a performance. Tonight is about integrity, Kendra began, voice smooth and warm. Because when people give, they trust us to protect every dollar. She smiled at the front tables where Bryce Langford stood with his glass raised, looking like a loyal husband and a future CEO. But Dana was still near the coat check corridor, the folder heavy in her hand, the pen imprinting her palm like a bruise. A security guard stayed close enough that Dana couldn't step away without making it obvious. She could feel eyes turning toward her as if someone had already pointed her out. Kendra's tone shifted. Sometimes, she said, the biggest threat isn't outside the foundation, it's inside the family. A murmur rippled through the ballroom. Dana's wedding ring felt suddenly too tight. She watched Kendra tap a remote and the screen changed. Numbers, columns, a neat table labeled reimbursements. Dana recognized her own name before she could stop herself from breathing in. Dana Holloway, Kendra said clearly, each syllable sharpened for impact. A volunteer who confused charity with personal entitlement. Heads turned, and donors leaned toward each other. A press photographer lifted a camera. Dana's iPhone buzzed in her clutch, another alert she couldn't ignore. Authorized user removed. Time-stamped within the same minute Kendra spoke. like Bryce was sealing her cage in real time. Dana tried to step forward, but the guard shifted, blocking her without touching her. Velvet ropes, bodies, and social rules pinned her in place. She opened her mouth anyway. That's not... Kendra lifted one hand, smiling like a teacher calming a disruptive student. Please, she said into the mic, don't embarrass yourself. We have documentation. Bryce finally spoke, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, soft enough to sound reasonable. Dana, stop. You're making this worse. The room exhaled as if that line confirmed everything. Dana felt her face heat with shame she didn't earn, and fear rose behind it. Ruth's care, Lila's safety, her license, her life. Then the ballroom doors opened at the back. A tall, older man stepped in, scanning the stage, scanning Dana, scanning the security near her like he was counting crimes. Harold Langford didn't sit down. He stood up, and the entire room went still. The room didn't erupt, it tightened. When Harold Langford rose in the back, a few heads turned like they'd felt a change in temperature. The older donors who usually chatted through speeches went quiet. Someone at the front table whispered, "That's the chairman," as if the title alone could restore order. Dana's heart lurched with a tiny, foolish hope. But Kendra didn't lose her smile. She lifted her chin toward Harold like she was greeting a late guest, all then glanced at Bryce for permission. Bryce gave a small nod, almost invisible, and the security guard beside Dana stepped closer, steering her away from the aisle. Dana could feel the crowd deciding, in real time, that she must be guilty if she was the one being moved. A woman in a diamond bracelet leaned to her husband and murmured, "How disgusting," not softly enough. Another guest raised an iPhone, filming Dana's face the way people film storms, safely from a distance. Dana tried to hold herself steady. Nurses learn how to stand in grief without collapsing. She kept her shoulders back, even as her cheeks burned. She caught Bryce's eye once, waiting for any crack of shame. His expression stayed smooth, professional, like he was watching a problem get handled. Near the coat check, the guard paused just long enough for the humiliation to fully land. "Ma'am, you'll need to leave the event area," he said politely, as if Dana had spilled a drink instead of being accused of theft. Dana swallowed. "My coat," she managed. The attendant looked down at a clipboard. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Langford already requested your items." Dana's stomach dropped. Her wallet was in her coat pocket. Ruth's facility card, the sticky note with the payment amounts, and the folded photo of Lila she carried on every shift. Worse, her nursing badge was clipped inside her clutch earlier, but now the pocket where it should have been felt empty. Behind her, laughter drifted from the ballroom as the program continued without a pause, as if her life had been a minor interruption. Dana reached for her phone to check the photo she'd taken of the iPad notifications, and saw her battery flashing red, 1% like a countdown. From the security desk, a supervisor lifted a tablet and said quietly, "We saved the footage before anyone could delete it." Dana didn't remember walking out of the ballroom. One moment she was trapped behind velvet ropes and polite faces. The next she was in a service hallway that smelled like lemon disinfectant and hot linen. The music faded into a distant thump, like a heartbeat she didn't trust. Her iPhone flashed 1% before the screen dimmed. She pressed it to wake again and again, trying to hold on to the one photo she'd taken. The proof that Bryce's money moved the same minute Kendra spoke her name. The battery warning popped up like a final insult. At the end of the corridor, a metal door stood half open, staff only. Dana slipped inside and found a quiet stairwell with gray concrete steps and a single buzzing light. No chandeliers, no applause, just the cold truth of being alone. She sank onto a step, clutching her empty hand where her nursing badge should have been. Her throat tightened until it hurt. She thought of Ruth's shaking hands, of Lila's lunch note still on the counter at home, of the way Bryce had looked through her as if she was already erased. Tears came fast and silent, the kind you swallow at work until your body stops listening. Dana pressed the heel of her palm to her mouth and let the sob shake out anyway. In her head, one sentence formed, clear as a vow. I'm done begging. Her phone vibrated weakly, one last pulse, and a voicemail preview from Ruth's facility appeared before the screen dimmed again. Coverage verification still pending. Care levels may be adjusted by morning. Dana tried to call back, but the call failed. No service in the stairwell or no battery. Either way, it felt like the world choosing cruelty. Footsteps sounded on the other side of the door. Dana wiped her face hard, trying to make herself presentable, as if shame had rules even here. The door cracked open and the security supervisor she'd seen earlier stepped in, tablet tucked under his arm. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed drama. He looked like a man who documented it. "Ma'am," he said quietly, eyes steady. "They tried to flag the footage. We saved it first." He slid a plain business card into her hand. On the back, a timestamp was written in black ink, down to the second. Her phone lit up with a new message. "Mr. Harold Langford wants you in the security office, now." Dana left the Ritz just after midnight through a staff exit, the cold Manhattan air slicing through her thin wrap. The security supervisor walked her to the curb like she was someone who needed protection, not someone who'd been accused. Dana didn't feel protected. She felt erased. She got a ride home from a nurse coworker who didn't ask questions, only said, "Get in," the way good people do when they sense a person is drowning. Dana kept staring at her phone, trying to keep it alive long enough to show the one photo she'd taken. When it finally powered down, the darkness of the screen felt like a door slamming. At home, the porch light was on, too bright, too intentional. The front lock didn't accept her key. She tried again, slower, like the lock might recognize her if she was gentle. It didn't. A motion light clicked on, illuminating a white envelope taped to the door. Temporary separation terms. It read in crisp legal font, along with a warning about harassment and emotional instability. Dana's throat closed. Bryce had moved from humiliation to paperwork in a single night. She called his number anyway. Straight to voicemail. Inside, through the glass, she could see her own coat draped over the hallway chair. Her coat, her wallet, her life. Close enough to touch and impossible to reach. She pressed her palm to the window like that could make it real. Then she heard soft footsteps behind her. Lila stood in the doorway of the neighbor's house across the hall, still in pajamas, clutching a backpack like a shield. Her eyes were wide but dry. "Mom," she whispered, voice breaking on the word. Dana crossed the hall and hugged her, hard and careful, like she could stitch safety back into place with her arms. Back inside the neighbor's kitchen, Dana's phone finally recharged enough to ring. It was the hospital. "Dana," her manager said, strained and formal. "Administration is placing you on leave pending review. A donor filed a complaint. We have to follow protocol." Dana swallowed the panic. "I didn't do anything." "I hope that's true," her manager replied, and the doubt in that sentence hit harder than any insult. Then Ruth's facility called. "Coverage verification is still pending," the coordinator said. "If we don't confirm by morning, we'll reduce services." Dana looked at Lila's face and forced her voice steady. "I will fix it, I promise." Her own hands betrayed her, shaking under the table. A new text arrived from an unknown number. "This is Harold Langford. Don't go home. Meet me on Park Avenue at 9 a.m. and bring nothing but your phone." Dana arrived on Park Avenue at 8:55 a.m., carrying nothing but her phone and the ache of a sleepless night. The lobby smelled like polished stone and expensive coffee, but she kept her eyes on the security desk, afraid someone would say she didn't belong. A guard checked her name, then nodded once and guided her to a private elevator. The conference room upstairs was quiet, all glass and gray leather. Manhattan spread out behind it like a painting. Harold Langford stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she entered, and Dana saw it wasn't anger in his face. It was shame. "I watched them do it to you," he said. And I didn't raise a son to hide behind a woman's silence." Dana's throat tightened. "Mr. Langford, I don't understand why you're helping me." Harold pulled out a chair, not asking, insisting. Because you're family, he said, voice firm. And because what happened last night wasn't just cruel, it was planned. Two people stepped forward. One was Marlene Shaw, a silver-haired attorney with calm eyes and a legal pad already filled with neat handwriting. The other was Terry Boone, head of corporate security, carrying an iPad like it weighed more than it looked. Terry tapped the screen. A paused video frame appeared. Kendra Vale in the hallway, leaning toward a staffer, her mouth forming the words Dana had heard. Flag the footage! The timestamp glowed in the corner, undeniable. They tried to lock it down, Terry said. We copied it first. Our chain of custody is clean. Marlene slid a single page toward Dana. It was the same authorization folder Bryce had pushed at her, except Marlene's copy had highlighted clauses and a note in the margin. Liability transfer. They wanted your signature to make the lie legal, Marlene said, and they started the smear early enough to threaten your job and custody. Dana's phone buzzed again. Ruth's facility. Dana flinched. Harold reached for his desk phone and dialed without hesitation. This is Harold Langford, he said when the coordinator answered. I'm guaranteeing Mrs. Ruth Holloway's care in writing today. You will not reduce a single service. Fax number is on file. Dana's eyes burned, but she refused to crumble. Harold ended the call and looked at her like a promise. You will not fight alone, he said, sliding a thick folder across the table. Then he opened it to one printed email and said, This proves who started the frame-up, but we need one last witness to end Kendra in front of everyone. Marlene didn't waste time on comfort. She opened her MacBook, pulled the conference room blinds halfway, and turned the city into a muted backdrop behind hard facts. Here's how they built your fall, she said, sliding a clean timeline across the table. Terry connected his iPad to the screen, and the first clip played. Kendra in the corridor, leaning close to an AV tech, handing over a USB drive labeled in block letters. The timestamp matched the moment Dana had been pushed toward the coat check. The next clip showed Bryce handing a folded paper to the head of security. Dana's name visible for 1 sharp second, before the paper disappeared into a jacket pocket. Dana's stomach turned. So it wasn't just the speech, she whispered. No, Harold said. His voice held something old and dangerous. It was an operation. Marlene pulled up foundation logs. She pointed to rows of reimbursements. Neat, professional, believable. These were initiated under Kendra's credentials, she said. But approvals came from Bryce's device. That means 2 keys, 2 hands. Terry added, We have the hotel's sign-in sheet for the restricted AV closet. Kendra badged in twice. Bryce's assistant badged in once. Dana stared at the numbers, trying to breathe. It felt like reading her own autopsy. Harold leaned forward. Your mother's care is secured, he said, as if he could sense the lever Bryce had used. So Bryce has no hostage anymore. Marlene nodded. Next is your job. We'll send your hospital a sworn statement that you were publicly accused without evidence and that an internal audit is underway. That buys you time. Dana's phone buzzed. A message from her manager. Admin meeting 3 p.m. Dana's hands shook. Marlene's voice stayed steady. You'll go with counsel. You will not walk in alone again. Then Marlene opened one final file. A scanned authorization form. Dana's name typed above a signature that looked like hers but wasn't. The curve of the D was wrong. The pressure points were off. Dana's blood went cold. I never signed that. Harold's jaw tightened. My son forged your name. Terry zoomed in on the signature and said quietly, Yeah, we can prove it with metadata and the notary log. Dana felt something shift inside her. Not relief, not yet, but a clean, hard certainty. They weren't guessing anymore. They were building a case. Marlene closed the laptop and said, We can end them. If we get the one missing piece, Kendra thought no one would ever find. Hai fat trien fan, moi sao cho jubon tramtu, Jambao viet jung bontram tu chicho su shedishnam. Moitu ban ginoho jio nai no jambao kich ban kaudruk trio view. Viet bang tiengan. My Marlene didn't celebrate the forged signature. She treated it like an infection. Identify it, isolate it, document it, then cut it out cleanly. Forgery is one crime, she said. But it's not the only lever they pulled. The question is, how do we stop Bryce from rewriting the story again before we get in front of the board? Harold's gaze stayed on the skyline for a moment, like he was measuring the distance between power and truth. Then he walked to a credenza and unlocked a drawer with an old brass key that looked like it belonged to another era. He pulled out a slim folder. Cream paper, heavy seal, something you wouldn't toss in a desk with spare pens. I never wanted you dragged into Langford governance, Harold said quietly. You didn't marry me, you married my son. Dana's stomach tightened. What is that? Harold set the folder in front of her. It's a trust amendment, signed and notarized 2 years ago. Marlene's eyes sharpened as she read. Terry leaned in, silent but alert. Harold spoke slowly as if each word mattered. When I had my health scare, you were the one who drove me to appointments. You tracked my meds like you track your patients. You never asked for anything. That kind of character is rare in the city. Dana's throat closed. She remembered those mornings, Harold stubborn, embarrassed, trying to act strong while she held the paperwork and pretended it was normal. The amendment says, Marlene read aloud, if Bryce engages in conduct that threatens the Foundation's integrity or uses it for personal gain, a temporary voting proxy transfers to Dana Holloway for the purpose of triggering an emergency audit and board review. Dana stared, stunned. That can't be real. It's real, Terry said. Notary log checks out. Chain of custody is solid. Dana looked at Harold. Why didn't you tell me? Harold's jaw tightened. Because I thought my son would come to his senses. And because I was ashamed I needed to protect you from him. Marlene tapped the page. This changes everything. Bryce can't block an audit. He can't bury evidence. If he tries to force a narrative, you can legally force the room to look at the facts. Dana's hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from the sudden shock of possibility. So I'm not trapped. Harold met her eyes. His voice softened, but it carried steel. You were never powerless, Dana. He just worked hard to make you believe you were. Dana inhaled, slow and steady, like she was about to walk into a difficult room and keep her voice calm anyway. Marlene closed the folder and slid it back toward her. Marlene said, then we call the emergency board meeting, and we play the footage before Kendra can spin a single word. Dana didn't go back to Bryce's house. Harold insisted she stay in a quiet guest suite above his office. Secure elevator, no paparazzi, no surprise knocks. It felt unreal, like Dana had stepped out of her own life and into a corridor of glass and guards. Still, her chest didn't loosen until Marlene called the neighbor and confirmed Lila was safe. Eating toast at the kitchen table, backpack already packed for school. That afternoon, Marlene brought Lila to the office with a trusted aide, careful and calm, as if they were transporting something precious. Lila walked in holding Dana's old hoodie-like armor. Dana knelt and hugged her, breathing in the scent of laundry soap and pencil shavings. Ordinary things that still existed, even after public shame. I'm sorry you saw any of it, Dana whispered. Lila swallowed, eyes bright but steady. I didn't see the ballroom, she said. I heard Dad. Dana froze. What do you mean? Lila pulled out her iPhone with both hands like it was heavier than it should be. Last night, before you left, he was in the kitchen. He didn't know I was in the hallway. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. He was on the phone. He sounded different. I got scared. Marlene's posture changed immediately, professional focus snapping into place. Sweetheart, she said gently, did you record anything? Lila nodded. Just a little. I thought if he lied to you again, you'd need to hear it. Dana's throat tightened so hard it hurt. You did the right thing, she said, and meant it. Not because she wanted her child in the middle, but because truth, in their world, was oxygen. Marlene plugged the phone into her MacBook and played the clip. Bryce's voice filled the room, low and confident, like a man planning a merger. After tomorrow, she'll have no one, he said. Once she's shamed, she'll sign. If she doesn't, security escorts her out anyway. Either way, she's finished. Terry Boone exhaled through his nose. Harold's face didn't move, but his eyes hardened. That's intent, Marlene said quietly. Not a misunderstanding, not drama. Intent. Dana stared at her own hands, still wearing the wedding ring Bryce had turned into a leash. For the first time, she felt something clean inside her. Certainty. Then Terry's phone buzzed. He glanced down and the color drained from his face. We have a problem, he said. Marlene looked up. What kind? Terry turned the screen toward them. Bryce just filed an emergency petition. He's claiming Dana is unstable and a financial risk. He's asking the court to block her from the foundation. And the hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning before the board can meet. Marlene didn't panic when Terry showed the court notice. She got quiet the way surgeons get quiet before the first cut. Bryce is trying to win the story with a judge's stamp, she said. If he can label you unstable, he can freeze you out of the foundation and poison custody optics in one move. She looked at Dana. But he filed fast. That means he's scared. Harold picked up his desk phone and made 2 calls without leaving his chair. One to the foundation's outside counsel, one to the board secretary. No one cancels the emergency audit, he said, voice flat. Not my son. Not his girlfriend. Not a petition built on lies. Dana sat with Lila in the guest suite afterward, braiding her daughter's hair the way she used to when Lila was little and storms felt smaller. You don't have to come anywhere tomorrow, Dana told her. You stay with Mrs. Keene, you go to school. You keep being a kid. Lila nodded, and Dana felt the sharp ache of gratitude that her child was still gentle in a world that wasn't. At 10 p.m., Marlene spread documents across the conference table. The trust amendment, the forged authorization, the reimbursement logs tied to Kendra's credentials, and a transcript of Lila's audio clip. Sanitized, child-protected, legally clean. Terry added a chain of custody statement for the hotel footage, with timestamps down to the second. Dana watched Marlene type on a MacBook Air, emotions and affidavits assembling into a weapon made of paper. Harold signed his sworn statement with steady hands, the kind of signature that made rooms obey. Tomorrow, Marlene said, we don't argue feelings, we argue facts. Dana went to the window and stared at Manhattan's lights. She thought of the ballroom stairs the way humiliation had tried to turn her into silence. She made herself a promise she could keep. I will not beg. I will not rush. I will stand. She opened a Kindle she'd brought from home and read one paragraph from Meditations, not for wisdom, but for steadiness. Then she set it down, slipped her wedding ring off for the first time in years, and placed it in a small dish like a decision. Near midnight, Terry's phone buzzed. He answered, listened, and his face tightened. It's the Ritz, he said. Someone just requested the gala footage, using an executive authorization code. Terry looked at Harold and said, the request came from Bryce's office. He's trying to delete the video before court. Dana sat at the long boardroom table in Harold's Park Avenue headquarters, hands folded to keep them from shaking. Across from her, Marlene arranged exhibits like a nurse laying out instruments, trust amendment, forged authorization, reimbursement logs, and Lila's audio transcript with the child's name redacted. Bryce arrived 10 minutes late with Kendra at his shoulder, both dressed like nothing had happened. He gave the room a calm smile that made Dana's skin crawl. This emergency meeting is unnecessary, he said. My wife is going through something. We should handle it privately. Harold didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table, his palms flat, voice steady enough to cut glass. You humiliated her publicly, he said. So we correct it publicly. Kendra's smile held. Chairman Langford, she began. We have documentation. Marlene clicked a remote and Terry's iPad mirrored to the screen. The first clip showed Kendra in the hallway slipping a USB drive to the AV tech. The timestamp glowed in the corner. The second clip showed Bryce handing a folded paper to security. Dana's name visible, the order clear in body language even without audio. A board member inhaled sharply. Another muttered, "That's not optics, that's orchestration." Marlene brought up the reimbursement ledger. Initiated under Ms. Vale's credentials, she said, pointing to the logins. Approved from Mr. Langford's device. Then she displayed the forged signature beside Dana's real signature from her nursing license file. The difference was obvious, even to people who didn't want to see it. Kendra's composure cracked for half a second. This is a misunderstanding, she said too quickly. Harold's voice didn't rise. No, he said. It's betrayal, fraud, and cowardice. He turned to the board. Effective immediately, Kendra Vale is terminated. Security will escort her out. Council will notify the authorities regarding misuse of foundation funds. Kendra's face went pale as two security officers approached. Bryce stepped forward, anger flashing through his polish. You can't do this, he snapped. Dana manipulated you. Harold didn't blink. Sit down, son. You're done speaking. The board voted. Removal pending investigation. Audit triggered. Legal hold issued. Dana felt air return to her lungs for the first time in weeks. Bryce's mouth tightened into something ugly, and he pulled a folded document from his jacket like a final weapon. He slapped it on the table and hissed, "Enjoy your win, because the court just granted me temporary custody of Lila." Marlene didn't even glance at the paper Bryce slapped down. She held out her hand calmly. May I? When Bryce hesitated, Harold's voice cut in. Quiet. Absolute. Give it to her. Bryce slid it across like he was still in control. Marlene read for 5 seconds, then looked up. This is an ex parte temporary order, she said, loud enough for the board to hear. Granted without Dana present based on allegations, not proof. And the hearing to review it is scheduled within 48 hours. You filed this to shock her into silence. Dana's stomach still dropped, but she didn't crumble. She thought of Lila's small hands holding that phone like truth was fragile. Dana lifted her chin. Where is my daughter right now? She asked. Bryce's smile twitched. With my sister. Terry Boone's phone buzzed. He listened, then met Harold's eyes. Lila is safe, he said. Mrs. Keene confirmed pickup was attempted, but Marlene's legal notice blocked it. Lila stayed at school. She's with the counselor now. Marlene stood and slid a new document onto the table, already prepared. Motion to vacate, she said. And attached. The hotel footage, the reimbursement logs, the forged signature comparison, and the audio transcript proving Bryce planned to isolate Dana and use security to stage her removal. She turned to Bryce. Yuki, you told a judge she's unstable while you were forging her name and moving foundation funds. That's not strategy, that's fraud. Harold faced the board. The Langford name will not cover criminal behavior, he said. Not even my son's. By noon, counsel had filed the motion and requested sanctions for misrepresentation. The foundation issued a formal correction statement clearing Dana's name and confirming an independent audit. By the next morning's hearing, the judge had watched the timestamps, read the logs, and heard Bryce's own words. The temporary order was reversed. Dana was granted primary custody, Bryce supervised visitation until investigation concluded. Kendra's career ended the way she tried to end Dana, publicly, with documentation. She was terminated, named in the audit findings, and escorted out of every room that once applauded her. Weeks later, Dana walked back into her hospital wearing her badge again. Ruth's care stayed steady under a protected medical fund. Dana moved into a modest apartment near Central Park. Quiet, sunlit, hers. She kept her wedding ring in a dish, not as a wound, but as a reminder. Love without respect is a cage. And when Evan Mercer, hospital compliance, steady-eyed, kind, asked her to marry him months later, it didn't feel like rescue. It felt like peace earned. Dana said yes. So that's the end of the story, and if you're still here with me right now, it means something in Dana's journey touched your heart in a real way. And I get it, because the lesson isn't just karma wins. It's this. Dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you protect, even when your voice shakes. Dana didn't win by getting louder. She won by getting clearer. Facts, boundaries, witnesses, and the courage to stop begging for basic respect. The Stoics had a simple anchor for moments like that. Focus on what you can control. As Epictetus reminds us, it's not events that break us, but the story we let those events write inside us. Dana stopped letting other people narrate her worth. She chose truth over optics, calm over chaos, and step-by-step action over panic, and that's where healing starts in real life too. If you're carrying something similar, feeling trapped, doubted, or erased, please remember, you're not powerless. You're just overdue for support and a plan. And hey, if this story meant something to you, hit like, share it with someone who needs strength today, and subscribe so we can keep choosing truth together.